Hello, everyone. As John said, my name is Mike Hartnett. I'll be talking to you today about site-specific safety plans. Through this training, we'll talk about what specifics we need to have in that plan, and then we'll finish up with how to make that plan into a template that can limit how much work is done for future plans. A little background on myself. I spent 15 years as a union painter in the IUPAT, doing commercial and industrial. I even spent a couple of years in residential prior to starting my safety career. So I started my safety career back in 2012. Been a little over a decade, and mostly I've been working with the utility companies and then consulting. So hopefully I can have some information that can really serve the members here at FCA. So I start off, as always, to tell you about the FCA safety help. If you have any questions, if you have a conundrum related to safety, you're not sure how to handle, or you just need some advice about something safety related, do not hesitate to call the safety helpline. This number ends up coming directly to myself or somebody else on my team. We'll find the best person to answer your question, reach back out to you, and help you get those answers. All right, so the outline of today. What is a site-specific safety? As a safety guy, I have to use acronyms. It's part of the whole DNA. But a site-specific safety plan is what we're looking at, and we want to see what the anatomy is. What are the pieces we need to put together? Start with general information, go to emergency procedures, safety rules, inspections, what the site-specific hazards are, what the OSHA, how we're going to handle OSHA and incidents, and then how we're going to handle training related to site-specific safety plan. And then last but not least, what resources can you provide for your frontline supervision with this package? So I'll start with what is a site-specific. Many of us are being asked by general contractors to provide a site-specific safety plan. And a lot of times what happens is we send them our safety manual. It's not very specific to the site and doesn't really help us with that pre-planning stage. A site-specific safety plan can take into consideration those more challenging aspects of a job. We all know when we have a big job for a big general contractor, there's generally at least one part of the scope that is outside the normal avenue of what we do, right? Something that's a little bit more difficult, that takes a little more pre-planning. And this is one of those ways we can really help make this document that we're required to provide actually help us be more efficient, help us be more safe. So that's something that we really want to look at. How can we take this plan and make it something that makes us more competitive, right? Able to bring those jobs in on budget while protecting our employees and our bottom line. So we'll start with the first part, general information. General information is just what it sounds like. Need to make sure that we have all that information specific to that job, right? Project name, location, number. Any of the company contacts for people in your company that will be working on this. We may want to also add to this the contact information for the superintendent of a general contractor that we're, or the project manager of that, so that the foreman or superintendent from your side knows who to contact. Then we need to make sure we start adding responsibilities into that general information. We really want to put together a list of our competent person for that job. So we have many different standards that require competent persons to be on site for working. Right? For scaffolding, we need a competent person on site. For fall protection, we need a competent person on site. Silica, once again, competent person on site. These are all very common tasks that we have to deal with on almost every job. So having that competent person detailed is really important. Now, competent person doesn't have to do with competency, right? It's a definition given by OSHA that says a person's capable of assessing hazards, recognizing hazards when they exist, and they have the authority to correct those hazards, right? Eliminate those exposures. So it's a two-part definition. This person has to know what they're looking for and be authorized by the employer to correct. So it's important we have those lists on. The name and the contact information for that person can really help in an emergency. Also, we need to make sure that we define that scope of work. Right? We want the scope of work laid out by the general contractor so that we have it for reference ourselves. I know many times when I was working as a foreman in the field, and word of mouth is where I found scope, right? I got scope through word of mouth. Some of it was clear, some of it wasn't. And at times I was between a rock and a hard place where I had a general contractor and a superintendent both telling me different things, right? So being able to have that scope can really be helpful. When a foreman has the time to be able to look at it and determine whether or not it is and show their superintendent if they need to, or demonstrate it to the superintendent for the general contractor that it's outside of lines. Next, we go to the emergency procedures. And this is one of the larger parts and one of the more helpful parts of a site-specific safety. First of all, we need to have that emergency contact list, right? Fire department, police department, emergency medical services. We need to make sure that we know how to get where we're going. Right? If we have an occupational health clinic, we need to make sure that we add the address to it so that if there is an injury that doesn't require an ambulance, we can get them there. It doesn't require an emergency room. We can get them to the occupational health clinic. Now, we always suggest you put a map, print out a MapQuest map. I guess MapQuest isn't a thing. Doesn't matter. Print out a MapQuest map or a Google map that has the directions of how to get to that hospital from the route. This can, from the job site. This can become really important if we have a medical emergency. Someone's doesn't want to call an ambulance, but they're feeling chest pains. I know I myself have had that situation when in the field, where somebody I was working with had those chest pains, refused an ambulance, but was willing to get in the car and drive to the hospital. So it's important that we have these quickly and accessible. Then we have information that we may not know, right? Information that we're going to have to get from the general contractor. When we have a site, we have a site map like you have on the bottom right, we need to have a muster point, right? If there's an emergency, if there's a fire or there's an evacuation for some reason, we need to know where the muster point is. Otherwise, we end up in a situation where everyone who's evacuating goes wherever they want to. And then it's hard to account for people. In that case, what ends up happening is that our emergency services, our firefighters, will often go into a building that doesn't have anybody to try to save somebody who's actually somewhere else. So we want to make sure that we have those muster points determined by the general contractor and we know where they're at. We want to know what their procedures are, right? What are their notification methods for fire or for evacuation? What are their notification methods for severe weather? Now, I know a lot of our jobs, we will have people in fall arrest gear. Whenever we put somebody in fall arrest PPE, we are required to have a rescue plan so that we can get them out of that fall arrest if they do fall prior to suspension trauma setting. And suspension trauma, we've discussed a few times on these monthly calls, but what it comes down to is the pressure from the harness on the inner thighs cuts off the veins so that blood is not returning to the body, causing a lack of oxygen. causing somebody to lose consciousness and possibly pass. So it's really important that we have those rescue plans. Now, if we're doing boom lift, those rescue plans are really easy. Go to the ground controls and lower the basket, right? But if we're working in a high-rise facility, right, working up on, 6th, 8th, 10th floor, or doing the work I was doing, swing stage, 30 stories up on Michigan Avenue, that fall rescue plan needs to be developed. And granted, it's unlikely that fall rescue plan is going to be, but in the case that we need it, it is a life or death situation. Additionally, when we're talking about those emergency procedures, we should be listing where we are putting our first aid kits. If we have an AED on site, we should list it. Now, granted, that may be, it's in the gang box, right? And that works fine. But we want to make sure we're stating where our first aid kits are and where our fire extinguishers are, the ones that we are providing. And we should be providing fire extinguishers anytime we have a shop with solvents, right? So if we're dealing with any oil paints, any solvents, we want to make sure we have a fire extinguisher where we're storing that material. So the next part are the safety rules. You start with your general safety rules. General safety rules, if you look in the FCA manual, in Chapter 2, they have a list of general safety rules, and then they have a list of general office safety rules. So on your site-specific safety plans, you're going to want to, copy this out of your manual and paste it into the site-specific safety plan. These are the rules that all of your people have to follow all the time. Then you have site-specific safety rules. These are generally ones that are told to you by the general contractor. We have a 4-foot fall protection rule. Anybody above 4 foot, whether they're on a ladder or a scaffold, always needs to be wearing fall protection. That's a rule that you don't normally use. Then you want to make sure that that is listed in those site-specific rules. And then stop work authority. If you have stop work authority, this is a good place to make sure that it's listed so that your general contractor is aware that all of your people have that stop work authority. And I know we have a stop work authority chapter in the FCA manual. If you are not using it and training on it, I really do suggest you do. Next, let's talk about the inspection plan. Now, we're required to do a whole lot of inspections. The most basic inspection, which is one that if there is an injury on your site and OSHA comes to investigate, I guarantee you they're going to ask for your inspections. When did you last inspect this site for hazards? Can you provide documentation for it? Right? And that's 192620B2. Such programs shall provide for frequent and regular inspections of the job sites, material, and equipment to be made by competent persons designated by the employer. So we should be specifying who's responsible for that job, right? Now, on a smaller jobs, it's clearly going to be the foreman. But when you have a general foreman, multiple foremen on a job with a large operation, you may be having multiple different people as competent person for different aspects, right? But we should list how often we're doing site inspections. OSHA requires us to do it periodically, right? That means at a set interval. They don't really define that timeline. But if if that time frame is annually, it's not going to hold. Anything less than monthly or anything with a bigger span than monthly is not going to do it. And it really depends on the size of the job and the complexity of the job. Very fast moving big jobs with a lot of people would require at least weekly inspections. So we want to make sure that we are documenting our inspections, know who's performing them, we know how often they're being performed. And when we find things on our inspections, we need to document correction. Otherwise, what we're doing is compiling a list of hazards that we know about and are willfully ignoring because we haven't documented that we've corrected the issue. And that opens you up for the possibility of a willful citation. So we want to make sure that we are tracking our corrective actions for those inspections to closure. You also want to make sure you have a list of other inspections that are going to be performed. If you have scaffolding, you want to have your daily scaffolding inspection stated. Fall arrest PPE. How often are you doing a inspection on your fall arrest? Right. According to OSHA, it's annually. According to ANSI, it's twice a year. Right, every 6 months. On top of the person who's inspecting the harness prior to wearing it each time. And then mobile elevated work platforms or aerial lifts, those have to be inspected prior to use each time. So do we have the correct inspection forms for that? Do we know who's doing that one? Then we get to the bulk of the site-specific safety plan. Here's where you're going to list your major hazards and your most frequently encountered hazards, right? Your major programs of what you're dealing with. Now, I do not suggest that you send an entire safety and health manual, right? I don't expect the general contractor to read very closely through your site-specific safety. They might look at it if there's an issue to see what you say, how you perform the work, how you determine the work should be performed. And that is what your safety and health manual generally says. So what I'd suggest you do is take the big ones, right? Fall protection, respiratory protection, hazard communication, scaffolding. Think of PPE, any other of the hazards that we're dealing with on a daily basis, and take a part of that out of your safety manual. You do not need to put in the scope. You don't need to put in the responsibilities, right? You don't have to go through all of the training that's going to be done, when it's going to be updated and all of that. What I suggest you do is look for the section that says hazards and put those hazards in. And then the section that says hazard control measures and list all of the hazard control measures. Right, so 42.4 and anything with 42.5, right? So the fire and explosive hazards would be in it, fire prevention would be in it, all of that. So we want to make sure that we list all of our hazards that are in our manual and all the mitigation that is in our manual. Right? By doing that, we can really give them a good idea of what we do with those hazards without giving them our entire safety and health. You're also going to want to look here, and this is one of the places where you can make back some of that time that you're putting into putting a site-specific safety. And this really should be done during the estimating phase. When you have your drawings in and you're looking at it, and you can see what areas are going to be problematic. You know that there's power lines coming in on the southwest corner of that building, and you have to paint all of it. You're going to be using mobile elevated work platforms to get to it. So how are you going to deal with that hazard? Knowing ahead of time that you have to call the power company, give them to insulate those lines, or see if you can get an outage so that you can do it. Knowing that months ahead of time is often the only way you can get it performed. In my experience, when I was in the field, and it's been a decade since I was in the field, so things have changed. But we always did what we could with what we had, and get it done was the name of the day. Now, hopefully, you've worked on the culture within your organization, and your foremen say, that's not in line with how we do the work, so we're not going to. I know what I heard a lot of is, if you don't want to do it, we'll find somebody who will. we want to make sure that we put those plans together so we never have to have that situation. When we have that difficult scaffolding situation, we're not sure exactly how to do. The best way to know it is to look at it at the estimating phase, determine how we're going to execute it, and add those costs onto our estimate, because you're going to be spending those costs, or your frontline workers are going to be taking risks, right? So we want to make sure that we have that plan ahead. And by really looking at the scope of the work for the contract during that estimating phase, where those problem areas are, and come up with an idea of what we're going to do for a solution and what that's going to cost, we can be far more effective at bidding our work. So next, we want to make sure that we have a section on OSHA and incidents, right? So hopefully you have a procedure for if OSHA ever comes onto site, what you're going to do to manage that. Whether that's call your safety person, call your superintendent, call an outside contractor like me to come and help work with OSHA. You should have a detailed plan for that your foremen are fully trained on. They really need to know how to react to an OSHA inspector when they come on site. We also need to define how we do our incident injury reporting. What do our employees do for incident and injury reporting? What do they do for near miss reporting? And then what is our process for incident investigation? These are very important for us to be learning organizations, and it's important for us to show the general contractor that we are good about learning from our past mistakes, right? Learning those lessons is a very important part about not repeating. So having that laid out in your site-specific safety plan is generally something that is looked for. Training and orientation. Are we going to have a training and orientation for the site? It really depends on what the general contractor wants. The general contractor may run their own orientation. But we need to make sure we have some level of training going on when we have a site-specific safety. Whether that's reviewing of the fall arrest rescue plan and the emergency action plan for the site, right? And looking at those specific hazards within the scope, it's important that we train our employees on that and we specify how we're doing it. Now, training isn't always in a classroom. That training can be around the gang box with the foreman saying, here's a muster point. One blast says that there's an evacuation. Two blasts say that it's a shelter in place. Whatever their procedure is for that general contractor, we need to know that information, and so do the people on site. And we want to make sure that we have a way to document it. Just a sign in is fine. Sign in when you have read through the emergency action plan for the site. And the last part is having supervisor tools, right? Resources for your supervisor. What will your foreman need on site? In the painting industry, I really suggest a site-specific SDS book. You do not have that many different materials at each job that a site-specific SDS book isn't helpful. When do we really need a site-specific SDS? Generally, in an emergency, right? Somebody gets it into their eyes, and we need to know what the first aid is. How long will it take your people to get to the right SDS if we don't have it thinned out for the specific job? Just one of those things that makes it easier to find. And it also makes it more accessible for your frontline workers so that they can see it. Additionally, a general contractor is supposed to request it, right? I don't know that that's something that happens very often, but part of their responsibility is to know what chemicals are on their site. So having that SDS, site-specific SDS, as part of your site-specific safety plan is very helpful. Inspection forms, right? If we have an inspection checklist for the site, if we have an inspection checklist for the scaffold, if we have an inspection checklist for the aerial work platforms, we want to make sure that we get those and have them available. Right? We have those available for the foreman. An additional contact list from that very beginning, that first page of the site-specific safety plan. We want to have an additional one that we can hang up in the shop or we can hang up in the gang box. And same with that site map and the hospital map. Both of those should be, you should have additional copy of that so it can be hung up in the gang box or in the shop. That way, if there is an emergency, we know how to get it. Because we never know who that emergency is going to happen to. If the foreman's the only one who knows where it is, and he's the one suffering from a heart attack, then how are we going to get it? So here's a quick checklist of the 10 things that I covered, right? The 10 different parts of general information, emergency procedures, location of first aid kits, fire extinguishers, safety rules, inspection plans, specific hazards, OSHA incidents, training orientation, and resources for frontline supervision. This is not for the presentation. At the end of the presentation, I will PDF this and send it to John. You can request a copy and then you'll have a copy of that checklist. Okay, so request me a copy of that training. We'll have that for you to use as a resource. So there's a lot of information here. Okay? There's a lot that we have to put in. I've seen site-specific safety plans that were hundreds of pages long, and they weren't very effective because you couldn't find anything that you were looking for. But usually it is going to be, more than 40 pages. Hopefully less than 80, right? But have that information that you need. It's a lot of work to put together 80 pages or 60 pages or even 40 pages of a site-specific safety plan. So the question is, what can we do to make it more effective? We build a template. When we build a template, we make it so that we have a good portion of what we need already taken care of. Now, it's a site-specific safety plan. So you cannot create a blanket site-specific safety plan to send out to all of your jobs. But what we can do is have all the information that is consistent throughout your jobs and put it in, right? Develop that consistent format using the checklist to give you a good idea of how to lay things out. Then with that template, you want to highlight all the sections that need to be customized for each site. That general information section, the emergency maps and procedures, those are all going to have to be specific to the site. If a general contractor requires safety rules above and beyond what is in your safety manual, those are going to be specific to that site. Same with those specific scope hazards. The resources for the frontline supervision, most of that information is taken from what is already listed above there. Right? So those resources for that frontline supervision really need to be customized each time. You also want to develop a list of questions for the general contractor. There are questions that we put, or answers that we put into our site-specific safety plan that we don't have. What are the site-specific rules for the general contractor? We need to reach out to the general contractor and find that information out before we put it into our safety plan. Same with their emergency action plan for that site. How do they notify? What are the muster locations? Those type things are really necessary. And then Train your frontline supervision on the document. We need to make sure that our frontline supervision know why it's important. What is in it that they can use, that they can need? What is the benefit to them? Right? If they're not aware of how this can help them do their job, then it's not very beneficial, right? And those things that don't help frontline supervision do their job generally are not utilized very well. Right? So we also need to make sure that they understand what their responsibilities are related to their plan. So if we look back here at that checklist, we know our general information here is going to be updated each time, right? It's going to be different every time we have a job. Our emergency procedure, some of it will, right? But we may have some of these that are the same, right? Occupational health clinic may say consistent, but the rest are probably all going to change. The location of your first aid kits and AED are generally pretty consistent, right? We generally put them in the same place no matter where the job is. It's generally in a gang box. If we don't have first aid kits that we're sending, we may ask the general contractor where theirs are, but realistically, we need to be providing our own. Location of those fire extinguishers is generally pretty consistent, right? We usually put them in our shop where we're using those solvents. Safety rules are going to stay the same except for the specific ones, right? And your stop work authority is going to stay the same if you're using it. So these sections can stay without any alteration. Your inspections plan is going to stay consistent on all of your jobs, right? On most of your jobs, at least. There may be some alteration, but it's pretty limited. Your major hazards are largely the same. You should be picking out the major hazards for your line of work, not necessarily for that specific job. That way we do not have to go through our safety and health manual, pulling sections out each time we create a site-specific safety. Use them in your template, put those major hazards and frequently encountered hazards as just a section of your template that you leave as is. Right? Update it as you update your manual, but other than that, we can keep that normal. Your site-specific scopes, obviously, are going to be updated, but your OSHA and incident responses should all be the same, right? Regardless of what site you're on, that's the same procedure. Your training and orientation is largely going to be the same from site to site. And then, of course, your resources are going to have to be altered. Right? So by looking at this, what we need to change and what we don't, we can build a template that will get us a large part of the work done so that we're only having that last 10%. And then after that initial investment of time, it actually becomes a benefit to have that specific thing instead of this thing that you have to put together. Right? So does anyone have any questions on that? Any specifics we can get into? Any challenges they've had in the past or specific things that have been asked for by a general contractor?
Any questions for Mike? Now's your chance. He's good. He's good. Test him.
You want to rewrite my entire SSSP for me?
No.
Oh, come on. You said ask. I asked.
Well, belongs to those who ask.
But it's unlikely to happen.
Beth, is there anything in yours that we did not address in the presentation?
No, I think I have all of that in the ones that we use. I think it's difficult when you're a safety director and you're not always in the know of. We do multiple scopes of work, so it's a little bit different here, but I don't always know exactly what the scope of work is. So I actually push the writing of our safety plans off to the project manager, because they're the ones that kind of know what scopes of work we're doing. And I just kind of look over them and make sure that they have everything.
Anybody else?
I just was wanting to add to Beth's comment there a little bit. I've run into that as well with project managers, and I found it very beneficial to just, yes, there are a lot of different projects that we need to be on, different scopes of work. Very beneficial. I do all of our safety submittals for Steinbrecher painting, and when I've got a project manager that hands me a safety submittal and says, hey, fill this out, the very first question I ask them, hey, what's the scope of work? So it kind of gets everybody communicating, and especially I'm with safety and quality as well. And I understand the struggle, and sometimes that communication barrier slips through because they think, oh, you're just safety and quality. Well, the reality of it is you're a pretty important person here. And when there's stuff going on the site, you're the one they're going to. So just that communication with the project manager and doing the paperwork actually is a huge benefit to you, rather than having a project manager do it, only because that way you're on that same page and you know what's going on that job site. I don't know if you do site inspections as well, but I personally do our site inspections. So it helps me know too, when I get on site, what is their job task? What is our scope of work? And if I find a guy doing something that was not our scope of work, that's going to be a big question for me. And then it's also beneficial not only to have your project managers communicating with you and allowing you to do that paperwork yourself. It just helps communication with the people out in the field as well to understand their positions and why they're doing what they're doing. So I understand, Beth. I get that too, that communication. They love to just send you right on over them safety submittals and be like, hey, fill this out. Yeah, we're going to talk about it. So yeah, that is difficult, but I'm going to tell you this, doing the paperwork, it's really beneficial if you're in the safety portion of it, because it helps you understand what's going on out there.
And you can really
Next time
see
your project
parts of-
managers do that, tell them to talk to you.
and you can see parts of that scope that are going to be challenging. That
Right.
maybe the project manager hasn't really considered it as being a challenge. Well, we'll just throw a lift in there.
Mhm.
Well, you said throw a lift on there, but there's a retention pond on that side, and there's not enough room.
Yeah.
Right? Deeper
And then
thought may often be given, and that communication can help foster.
Mhm. Yeah, and if something happens on site, first thing OSHA is gonna want to know, like you said, how often do you inspect those sites? Who's your safety? How is it documented? And if the project manager is just putting together this package for you, do you always know what that package looks like? So, and I've got a template that's, like you said, if once that first initial portion is done, taken care of, there's only going to be so much that has to be edited and changed. So the initial part of it takes a little bit of time of gathering information, but it's really super simple after that.
And I always suggest that we highlight those sections that we know are going to need to be edited, just to make it easier for us.
Yep.
Great, thanks, Penny.
Yeah.
I had a question over here. In terms of those inspections on job sites as we're going around, whether that's once a week to once a month, there comes a point where you've got a general contractor, like I recently had a general contractor, that their safety culture is just not there, and you can keep noting things to yourself and mention something to them the first time, but then I just find myself the next time I'm there, this particular nightmare site in mind, where I'm just noting observation only. noted in the past and like spoken to the GC or something like that.
And that
Where
documentation
I
is
don't,
hugely important.
yeah, and I don't think I'm creating that willful negligence anymore, because if I already brought it up to them and they just haven't fixed it, what's the point of this?
Well,
May be a relationship issue
and
if they're not fixing it.
here's
But
where it comes into play, right? You're right, as long as you're not exposing your employees to the hazard. But if you're exposing your employees to the hazard, you're not allowed to, right? That makes it a willful, that you've determined to expose your employees to that hazard despite knowing it's a hazard and not being able to correct it because it wasn't under your control. And OSHA has a multi-employer citation policy where they have controlling employers and correcting employers, creating employers, and exposing employers. So you could get a citation under an exposed employer, even if you have pointed out that hazard and communicated. What I suggest, and I do a lot of inspection in Chicago dealing with trades, and I've run into this problem a lot. And what I always give them the same advice. When you see something as a foreman, go and talk to the general contractor. If that general contractor hasn't corrected it or isn't willing to correct it, have your superintendent send an email to the general contractor stating, this is a hazard, it needs to be corrected, I cannot expose my employees to this hazard. And that can cause friction with the general contractor, and there's no question. But it's something that we need to do to protect our employees. And a lot of times, it's not necessarily the general contractor as a whole that has a problem with this, as much as the superintendent who doesn't want to, right? So communicating that up the line and documenting it is important. But exposing our employees to a hazard is also not allowed. So maybe we have to add better PPE, provide PPE for them if they're not providing it, right? If they're not repairing the fall protection guardrails that are up, you may have to put on fall arrest.
yeah, and in this specific site that I have in mind, you could go from one gamut of danger to life and limb, like, but in an area that I don't have employees working, so I can note that to them, and then the issue's dead to me until it's a dead issue for them in the bad term. But then you got, say, they chose to route their big baloney cords through stairwells, and these things are just, I'm not just talking about, they're not just flushed to the floor, they're all over the place. So it's like, okay, I've got that noted, and I can note that to them, but that's apparently their plan. So if you've got a 4-story building per se, like in this instance, and the issue just remains uncorrected throughout the whole job, well, know what the hell I do after that.
Well, I can tell you, Joseph, this is what you're going to do. If you put up with it on that job, you're going to get another job with that general contractor. And you're going to put up with it on that job. And then you're going to put up with it on the next job. It's challenging to give pushback to general contractors. And it's not always the foreman's job. Generally, if you're having problems with a general contractor not correcting that, you need to talk to your superintendents or your safety department and see if management can come up with a solution to help you. Because exposing our people to trip hazards in the stairway all the time is really a recipe for problems, right? And we look at it, and if we lose that job, that's going to be damaging. But if we have somebody trip on that cord, fall down that stairwell, lose the ability to do their job, the cost involved, not including the damage to the employee, will greatly outweigh what you're benefiting from that job. You know, and it ends up being rolling the dice. Having that safety as a value instead of a priority really becomes important, because those values are consistent. We need you to fix this, and we won't put our people at risk.
Here's some things that, and this has happened in the past, and unfortunately, it had gotten to the point where, our guys know to contact safety. Okay, safety goes in, they do their inspection. What a lot of it boils down to is foremans don't want the pressure or the heat on site. So it's easier for their foremans to report it now to safety, where safety is aware that there's an issue on site. Safety goes out, does a site inspection, and now it lands on safety and says, hey, I found this issue on this job site, and we need to correct it, and we needed to correct it within this and this much time. If it's life danger, of course, it's an immediate. Allow a little bit of time to get that taken care of, but at the same time, if there is danger in that area, then we need to come up with a plan and how do we reroute people around that certain area to keep them out of that situation that may be unsafe. Now, even if safety is not getting anywhere with on-site supervisors, safety then can reach out to general contractor, as you had mentioned before. It's up to the general contractor to also correct those issues. OSHA states, every employee must provide a safe workplace for each and every employee. That is also true for the general contractors. So a general contractor also has employees on site. Now, I know that we, at one point in time, basically said, okay, we've done our reports. We do all of our reports, our site inspections, safety inspections through iAuditor. We do have it very closely documented, and how we try to prevent an issue coming from a safety standpoint. At that time, if you're still not getting anywhere with the general contractor, it's okay to say, hey, you want to know what? We're going to pull our guys out of here for a day or two, or until you want to bring it up to safety standards. And that also falls under the right to stop work authority too. So if something's not up to safety standards, you have the right to stop work at any time and address it until it's been brought up to safety. So sometimes it should never have to get to this point. Usually by the time it gets to the DC, it gets taken care of. Unfortunately, you're going to run into those issues, but I'll tell you what, at the end of the day, that job superintendent wants that work done. So does the DC. So they're going to fix it. The last thing they want is their contractors pulled out of there. So sometimes you just got to push a little bit harder.
Yep, I agree, Penny.
Great stuff. Anything else for Mike?
By any chance, do you guys have like a template that you can show or share with us?
We don't have a template that we're providing. We have a checklist for you to build your own, but
Okay.
and we'll be providing a copy of this presentation. On this presentation is a checklist of what you want to do, and then a deeper description on each of them.
Mm-hmm.
That we've given you the ability to build it yourself.
Okay.
But if you go on Google and look for the site-specific safety plan template, you
Mm-hmm.
can find some very generic ones that will give you the bones you need to build, right? So, but this, I think, really does tell you all the key components you need to put.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate talking to you. I always enjoy talking to the painting contractors.
Thank you all for joining us. Like I said, we'll be doing a February call as well. We'll be getting the announcement for that. But can't thank you enough for joining us and the participation today. And it's always great to see new faces. And if you got any follow-up questions, Joseph, if you want a little further guidance or anything, don't hesitate to reach out to the safety helpline or us at any time. So we're certainly here for you as a FCA member benefit. So thank you so much for being with us today.